Rosalie Kerrigan knelt down in the cold standing water on Passyunk Avenue, just as the streetlights came on through the late autumn rain. And in a span of time too short for anyone on that street to think anything at all, she kept alive. The one woman half of Philadelphia quietly understood you were not supposed to touch. She had no idea who the woman was. She only saw a mesh grocery bag split open on the sidewalk, a few oranges rolling into the muddy gutter, and a white-haired woman sliding slowly down the glass wall of the bus shelter, as though someone had quietly drawn every bone out of her body. 3 cars had gone by before her. The first slowed down. The second flicked on its turn signal, and then flicked it off again, like a person changing their mind about their own decency. The third came to a full stop at the crosswalk, and the driver looked straight at the old woman through rain-soaked glass long enough to see everything there was to see, and then pressed the gas and kept going. A man in a suit stepped around her legs, without once lifting his eyes from his phone. Rosalie did not. She had just come off a shift so long that her feet hurt in her shoes, and hurt just as badly out of them. She had a few loose bills and a softened chocolate bar in her coat pocket, and she was walking home to sleep before the next night shift began. But she dropped her bag onto the wet asphalt and knelt, both knees sinking into the cold, one hand going under a stranger's head. The woman's skin was cold and damp. Her lips carried that gray-blue shade Rosalie had seen so many times that her body reacted before her mind did, and when she slipped 2 fingers against a wrist, as thin as tissue paper, she felt something that put ice down her spine. The pulse was not fast, and it was not erratic. It rose slowly, weakly, arriving late, like a narrow door trying to let an entire river through. This was not a spell of dizziness from age or cold rain. This was a heart running out of ways out. She called for someone to phone for an ambulance, then called again in the voice she used in the darkest hour of the night when someone stopped breathing at the end of a hallway, and the man in the suit stopped where he stood. She pulled off her only coat and laid it over a stranger's chest, sat in the standing water in nothing but thin scrubs, counted every beat beneath her fingertips, and spoke to her in that steady, level voice a person only earns after years of talking to people who cannot answer back. Then the old woman's eyelids flickered and opened, and those gray eyes sharp, startlingly clear. In no way the eyes of someone who had just gone down on a sidewalk looked straight into Rosalie's face, as though reading a name tag. "My oranges," she breathed. "Forget the oranges. $4 a bag. You forget them then." And Rosalie laughed, a rough, cracked sound that came out of her chest before she could stop it, while an ambulance siren began tearing through the rain at the far end of the avenue. She thought that was the end of it. An off-duty save, a handoff form signed in a hurry beside an open ambulance door, a story she would tell once and then forget. But 2 days later, that woman would sit up straight in a hospital bed, fold her newspaper closed very slowly, look at her with that same sharp gaze, and say the 5 words that would carry Rosalie Kerrigan across the threshold of the room, belonging to the one man nobody in that hospital dared to name out loud. "There's someone I need you to meet." If this story reaches you, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. The emergency bay at St. Bridget's smelled the way it always did on a wet night, wet coats and floor cleaner and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, and Rosalie Kerrigan stood at the foot of Bay 11, with the old woman's chart open in her hands, and read the discharge order twice before she believed it. Orthostatic hypotension. Advise increased fluids. Advise assistance when rising. Discharge to home. Dr. Winslow Pratt had written it in the clean, unbothered hand of a man who had already moved on to the next curtain, and he had signed it and left the clipboard hanging on the rail like a coat he did not intend to come back for. Rosalie looked at the woman in the bed. Her color had come back some. She was sitting up with her arms folded across the thin blanket, unimpressed by all of it, and she had already asked twice whether anyone had thought to bring in her grocery bag. But her ankles were swollen in a way that had nothing to do with rain, and there was a faint dusk of gray still sitting under her eyes, and when Rosalie had helped her out of the wet cardigan an hour earlier, the woman had needed to stop halfway and breathe. People did not need to stop halfway and breathe, because they stood up too fast. Rosalie found Pratt at the central desk, and she kept her voice low and even, the way she had learned to when a thing mattered. "Dr. Pratt, I'd like to hold on Bay 11. Her pulse is delayed and it's weak, late upstroke. I felt it out on the street before the ambulance came, and I felt it again 10 minutes ago, and it hasn't changed." Pratt did not look up from the screen. "She's 73. She was standing in the cold rain, and her pressure came right back up with fluids. That's a faint, Kerrigan. That's the most common thing in this building. Faints don't sound like that. Sound like what? Like a door that won't open all the way. She heard how it landed. She heard how it sounded coming out of a nurse's mouth to a man with letters after his name. There's a murmur radiating up into her neck, and it wasn't in the triage note. That plus the delayed pulse plus a syncopal episode on exertion is 3 things, not 1. And I'm not comfortable sending her out that door on her own 2 feet. Pratt turned around then. He was a tall man gone soft through the middle, with the tired courtesy of someone who had been doing this a long time and had stopped expecting to be surprised. And he looked at her with something that was not quite unkindness, which somehow made it worse. You want me to run an echo on a woman who fainted at a bus stop? I want you to run an echo before she goes home to an empty house and faints again on a staircase. Do you know what our wait times look like tonight? I do. I've walked past every one of them 4 times. Something in his jaw moved. He lowered his voice, and when he lowered it, he leaned in slightly, and Rosalie understood that this was the part where she was supposed to feel small. Let me say this once so we understand each other. You are an excellent nurse. Everyone in this department knows that, but the treatment decision belongs to the physician of record, and tonight that is me, and I have made it. Sign the discharge and get her out of the bed so I can put someone in it who is actually sick. Rosalie stood there for a moment. She thought about a folded piece of paper in her wallet that had been folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. She thought about how easy it was to be right on paper afterward. Then she picked up the chart, and she did not sign it. She wrote in the nursing notes, instead, in her own careful hand, that the discharge order had been received, that the patient exhibited a delayed and low-volume pulse, with a systolic murmur radiating to the carotids, that the syncopal event had occurred while the patient was upright and carrying a load, that the nurse assessment was inconsistent with the discharge plan, that the physician had been notified directly at the desk, and that per hospital policy the nurse was declining to sign and was escalating through the chain of command. She timed it. She initialed it. Then she picked up the phone at the wall and called the charge nurse. And then she called the number posted on the laminated card above the phone, the one nobody liked to call, the one that woke up the hospitalist on the rapid response line and put the whole thing into a record that could not be closed by one man walking away from a clipboard. Pratt watched her do it. You are making a mistake, he said quietly. Then it'll be mine. Behind her, a pair of shoes came squeaking up the hall and stopped. And Nadine Brooks, who had been running nights in that department for 19 years and had a voice that could flatten a room without ever rising, folded her arms and settled her weight and said, she called it Winslow. It's in the book now, so let's just go ahead and look. The hospitalist came down in 11 minutes with a portable machine on a cart, and Rosalie held the old woman's hand while the probe moved across her chest. And the room went very quiet in the way rooms do when the picture on the screen stops being an argument and starts being a fact. The valve barely opened. It flexed and shuddered and let through a thin, laboring stream. 3 cusps thickened and welded nearly shut by 73 years of quiet work, and the hospitalist said the word severe before anyone asked him anything at all. Morning came into the 4th floor, the way it comes into every hospital, gray and secondhand, arriving through a window that did not open. And Rosalie Kerrigan should have been home asleep 2 hours earlier, but she was standing at the door of 412 with a paper cup of coffee in each hand because she had wanted to see the woman upright before she let herself stop. Josephine Corvino was sitting against a stack of pillows with the bed cranked all the way up, wearing her own cardigan over the hospital gown because she had asked a nurse's aide to fetch it out of the belongings bag and had not phrased it as a request, and she had the folded newspaper on her knees and a ballpoint pen in her hand, and she was working the crossword in ink. She looked at the 2 cups, and then at Rosalie. One of those better be for me, or you can turn around. It's terrible coffee. Everything about this building is terrible. Sit down before you fall down. You look worse than I do. Rosalie sat. The cardiologist had come through at 7, and had used the words severe and critical and urgent, and had drawn a valve on the back of a paper towel because there was nothing else in the room to draw on. 3 little cusps that were supposed to swing open like a set of saloon doors, and instead had thickened and stiffened and fused into something closer to a keyhole. And he had said that the pressure the heart had to build to force blood through that keyhole was the reason a woman could carry groceries her whole life, and then one afternoon simply stop being able to. And he had said the word replacement, and then the word soon, and Josephine had listened to all of it, with her hands folded, and had asked exactly one question, which was whether he was any good. And when he had said yes, she had said fine then, and gone back to her crossword. Now she filled in a word and did not look up. "You're waiting for me to fall apart." "No, ma'am. Everybody's been waiting since 6. The little one who takes the blood, the man who mops, the priest, they didn't ask me if I wanted. They come in with the face." She tapped the pen against the page. "You know the face, head tilted over to one side like a dog hearing a whistle, the voice that goes up at the end of every sentence. Are we comfortable, Mrs. Corvino?" "We. I don't know who else is in the bed." Rosalie laughed into her coffee. "I've made that face." "I'm sure you have. You were young once, it happens to everybody." Josephine put the pen down then, and when she turned her head, her eyes were the same as they had been under the bus shelter, gray and unclouded, and entirely awake. "Let me tell you what actually happens, so you have it. You get old, and it isn't the body that goes first, whatever anybody says. It's the being seen. One day you're a woman who runs a business and holds the paper and knows the name of every child on the block, and then it goes by degrees, and nobody announces it. They stop asking you what you think, and start asking whoever came in with you. They talk over the top of your head about your own blood pressure. They put a hand on your back to move you out of a doorway like you're a chair somebody left in the aisle, and you're still in there the whole time. That's the part nobody guesses. You're still all the way in there." She looked at Rosalie. "I went down on a public street with 3 cars in front of me, and it wasn't a heart attack that did it. It was practice. Everyone's already been practicing not seeing me for about 10 years. Rosalie set her cup down on the tray table and did not answer right away. And the not answering was the answer, because Josephine watched her face and something in the old woman's expression shifted and sharpened. "You know that already," Josephine said. "Yes." "How old are you?" 27. "Then somebody taught you early." "Somebody did." "Who?" "That's a longer story than you have a heart, for this morning." Josephine snorted, a short dry sound, and picked her pen back up, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the strange thing was that the quiet did not need filling, and both of them noticed that, and neither of them mentioned it. Then somewhere below them, a set of doors opened. Rosalie would not have been able to say afterward how she knew, only that the floor changed, the way air changes before weather. A black SUV had come up onto the ambulance apron where no private vehicle was ever permitted to stop. And it had stopped anyway, and no one went out to move it. Voices in the corridor dropped by half. A resident stepped back from the counter without seeming to decide to. And a man came down the hall in a charcoal overcoat that hung open, unhurried, not large in any way a person could measure, but taking up the whole width of the hallway regardless, and the charge nurse straightened her spine as he passed, and did not look at him. And the cardiologist came out of the workroom before anyone had gone to get him. The man asked him 3 questions. What is it? Who is the best in this city for it? How soon can she be moved upstairs? He listened to all 3 answers without interrupting and without writing anything down. And then he said thank you. And the private floor was arranged in under 4 minutes, and orderlies appeared with a transport bed and a clipboard, and Rosalie stood and pressed herself back against the wall of 412 to let them work. Still holding the second cup of coffee, she had carried up 2 flights of stairs, and Elias Corvino walked past her close enough that his coat brushed the toe of her shoe, and bent to say something quiet to his mother, and went out again. And in the whole of it, he did not look at Rosalie once, not coldly, not rudely, not with any feeling at all, because a man does not look coldly at a thing he has not registered is in the room. 6 hours before he walked down that 4th-floor corridor, Elias Corvino was standing in a cold warehouse on the Delaware waterfront, watching a man empty his pockets onto a desk, and there was no shouting in the room at all. The building was one of the old ones, brick and corrugated steel, a place that had been holding cargo since before anyone in it was born, and at that hour it smelled like diesel and river water, and the peculiar dust that comes off pallets of anything. Out in the bay, the night shift was breaking down a container under work lights, and the sound of the chain hoist came through the office wall in slow strokes, and every one of those men knew what was happening behind the glass, and not one of them looked up. Wendell Tarr had run the loading office for 11 years. He was a heavy, friendly man who remembered birthdays, and kept a coffee maker going for the crew out of his own money. And for the last 2 years, he had been taking 4 hours off the sheet of every man who worked a double, which came to something small enough that no one wanted to be the one to make a fuss about it, and large enough, across 2 years, to have bought him a boat he kept down in Maryland. Augustus Fenn had brought the paperwork in a manila envelope and set it on the desk without comment, and then stepped back against the wall by the door, hands folded in front of him, the way he had stood in rooms for 35 years, first for the father and now for the son. Elias did not sit. He read the top 3 pages, which was all he needed, and then he closed the folder and stood there in his overcoat, with his hands in his pockets, and he let the silence go on long enough that Tar started talking into it, which was what always happened, and what he had been counting on. Tar talked about the boat, and then about his wife's medical bills, which may have been true, and then about how the men were paid better here than anywhere else on this river anyway, which was also true and which was the sentence that finished him. Elias waited until he had run all the way out, then he spoke, and his voice came down instead of up, the way it always did when the thing mattered, so that Tar had to lean forward slightly to hear him, and the leaning forward was its own kind of answer. I already know the number, so you don't have to give it to me. A pause. I'm not going to say it out loud in front of those men, because the minute they hear it, they'll have to decide what kind of men they are, and that's a thing I'd rather not put on them at 4 a.m. Another pause, shorter. Leave the keys. That was all of it. Tar sat very still for a moment. Then he took the office keys off his belt ring one at a time, and the small sound of the metal was the loudest thing in the room, and he set them in a little pile on the corner of the desk, and he stood up, and he walked out past Augie without picking up his coat. He was out of Philadelphia before the sun came up, and he did not come back, and no one ever went looking for him, and that was the entire mechanism, and it worked because everyone on that pier understood a thing about Elias Corvino that had never once needed to be demonstrated. His father had taught him that in this life a man had 3 rules, and if he kept them, nothing could ever be taken from him. Never explain yourself, because an explanation is a door, and every door can be opened from the other side. Never owe anybody anything, not money, not a favor, not a kindness, because a debt is a rope, and someone else is always holding the far end of it. And never, under any circumstance, let another person see that you need something, because the moment they see it, they will price it. His father had said all 3 of them to him across a kitchen table when he was 11 years old, in the same voice he used for the weather, and Elias had spent the 23 years since discovering that they were completely true and that they cost more than they were worth, and he had kept them anyway. The way a man keeps a house he inherited and does not much like. He picked up the keys off the desk and put them in his coat pocket and told Augie to have someone open the office at 6 so the day crew would not be standing outside in the cold. And he was walking out through the loading bay past men who suddenly had a great deal of work to attend to when his phone started going in his hand. He did not recognize the number. He almost let it go. Then he answered it, and a woman's voice said the words, St. Brigid's, and then the word mother. And Elias Corvino stood in the middle of that warehouse floor with the chain hoist swinging above him and found that he could not immediately make himself move, which was the first thing that had happened to him in a very long time that he would not have wanted anyone in the world to see. They sent Josephine Corvino home the following afternoon with a surgical date on a card and a bottle of pills and instructions not to lift anything, and she rode the whole way back to South Philadelphia, in the back of the black car, without saying a word, because she had spent the morning staring at the ceiling of a private room she had not asked for, turning something over. The name on the tag. She had read it twice under the bus shelter without knowing she was reading it, the way a person reads a street sign while falling, and then again in the fluorescent light of the emergency bay, when the woman had leaned in close to check her pupils. Blue tag, white letters, R. Kerrigan, RN. She could not have described the face afterward if her life had turned on it. Faces had been going soft on her for a few years now, but names did not go. Names had never gone. She had run a bakery on Christian Street for 41 years, and she could still tell you which of the Del Vecchio boys took his coffee light, and which one had married the girl from 2 Street. And this name had come up out of somewhere far down in her like a coin surfacing in a well. So when Augie helped her up the front steps and got her settled and went out to move the car, Josephine did not sit. She went down the narrow hall past the closed piano, with the cloth over it, into the front room, to the bureau under the window, and she opened the middle drawer that had not been pulled all the way out in 3 years, and she reached under the folded linen at the back and took out a single sheet of paper. It was hospital stationery, the cheap kind, softened with handling. Someone had written on it in a small, steady, forward-leaning hand, the whole of it in ink, and at the bottom, under the last line, in the same hand, was written R. Kerrigan, RN, and the date. Josephine sat down on the edge of the chair with the paper in both hands and stayed there a long time without turning on a lamp. And when Augie came back in, she asked him to find the woman, and Augie, who had learned in 35 years never to ask a Corvino why, said yes, ma'am, and went. It took him 2 days. He was waiting outside the staff entrance on Ellsworth Street on a Thursday evening in a coat too good for the neighborhood, and he was so careful about it, so plainly determined not to frighten her, that Rosalie almost laughed. He said his name. He said Mrs. Corvino would consider it a personal kindness. He said there was no obligation of any kind, and that a car could come. And he held out a small cream-colored card with an address written on it in a shaky, deliberate hand that was clearly the old woman's own. Rosalie looked at the card and did not take it. "Tell her I'm glad she's home," she said. "Tell her I hope the surgery goes well." But no. Augie nodded as though he had expected exactly that, and set the card down on the low wall beside the door, and said good evening, and went. Inside, in the locker room, Nadine Brooks listened to the whole account while she pulled her scrub top over her head, and then sat down heavily on the bench and looked at Rosalie the way she looked at new hires who had just done something dangerous by accident. "Baby, do you know whose mother that was?" "I know she runs a bakery." "Ran. 40 years. That part's true, and that part's the only part anybody says out loud." Nadine pulled her shoes on slowly. "The rest of that family runs the Longshore Local down at the port, and about 9 other things, and has since before you were born, and the reason nobody in this building said their name last night is that when a Corvino comes in through those doors, you get exactly what you saw. Everything moves. Nobody asks. Nobody writes an incident report about a vehicle on the ambulance apron. Not because anyone threatened anybody, because nobody wants to be the person who finds out what happens if you're the one who says no." She looked up. "That man is not somebody you go have a cup of coffee with." "I didn't say I was going. You didn't say you weren't, either." Rosalie went home to the apartment on Mifflin with the rain starting again, and she sat at the kitchen table without taking her coat off and opened her wallet. And there in the fold behind her badge was a square of paper worn to the softness of cloth, folded in 8, 4 years old, and beside it, unopened, a heavy cream envelope from a research fellowship in Denver that had arrived 11 days ago, and that she had not been able to make herself tear the flap on. She looked at both of them for a while, and what she kept coming back to was not the black car, or the man's coat, or the way an entire hospital had lowered its voice for him. It was the 4 minutes on the 4th floor, when he had asked 3 clean questions about a valve, and gotten 3 clean answers, and moved his mother upstairs like a piece of freight, and had walked past the woman who had knelt in the gutter for her, and had not seen her, not with contempt, not with anything, and how ordinary that was, and how she had spent her whole adult life watching what ordinary thing like that could do to people, if nobody ever said it to their face. She stood up. She went back downstairs, out into the wet, along the row houses to the wall by the staff door where the card was still sitting, gone soft and swollen with rain, the ink feathered but legible. She did not throw it away. She put it in her pocket. The address on the swollen card turned out to be a narrow brick row house on a street where the houses held each other up shoulder to shoulder. 3 marble steps, scrubbed pale, a hallway so tight that 2 people had to turn sideways to pass, and out back a fig tree wrapped in burlap and twine against the coming winter, standing in the little concrete yard like something bandaged and patient. A pot of gravy had been going on the stove since before daylight, and the whole house smelled of it. Josephine opened the door herself, said only that she had known Rosalie would come, and that she had already set a place, and did not give her the chance to say otherwise. Halfway down the hall, on the 3rd step of the staircase, a small girl was sitting with a coffee can of colored pencils beside her, and a piece of butcher paper across her knees. She had a great deal of curly hair and socks that did not match, and she looked up at Rosalie with frank, unhurried interest, the way children look at a thing they have decided to study before they decide to like it. Rosalie crouched down at the bottom of the steps to be at her height, and said hello, and asked what she was making, and the girl considered her for a long moment, and then turned the paper around and held it out. It was a fig tree, drawn with a great deal of care, every leaf given its own outline, and underneath it a row of small figures standing in the concrete yard. Rosalie said it was beautiful, and asked if she could look at it a while longer. And the girl nodded, and did not say anything, and did not seem to expect to, and went back to work on a second one. Josephine, from the kitchen doorway, said that was Wilhelmina, and that everyone called her Billy, and did not explain any further. And Rosalie, who had spent 6 years learning not to ask people for explanations they had not offered, did not ask. In the front room, between the window and the wall, there was a piano with a cloth over the whole of it. The folds gone stiff along the top, the way cloth goes when it has not been lifted in a long time, and a photograph face down on the closed lid, and Rosalie noticed both, and said nothing about either. They ate at the kitchen table. He came in near the end of the meal without any ceremony at all, hung the charcoal overcoat on the hook by the back door, kissed his mother on the top of the head, and sat down across from Rosalie, and when Josephine said, "This is the nurse," he said, "Thank you for what you did," in a voice that was perfectly civil and perfectly finished, and reached for the bread. So it was still going on, Rosalie thought, the not seeing. It had simply become a different shape. Then somebody knocked at the front door. 3 times, hesitant, the knock of a person who has been standing on the step for a while, working up to it. Elias got up. Rosalie could hear it all from where she sat, because the hallway was 10 feet long, and the house had no secrets in it. A woman's voice, young, apologizing before she had said anything at all. She said her name was Denise Rourke. She said her husband was Petey off the day gang at 9, and that his hand was not right yet, that the tendon had not come back the way the doctor said it would, that he could grip but he could not hold, and that the union had him on light duty, which was 2 shifts, and that 2 shifts did not come anywhere near it, and that she was not asking for money. She wanted to be clear about that. She was not asking for a handout. She was asking whether he could be put on the gate, or in the shack, or in the office answering the phone. Anything at all. Anything where a man could sit. She said they were 3 months behind. She said it, and then she said please. And there was the sound of a woman who had promised herself in the car that she would not cry, and had just discovered she was going to anyway. Elias let her finish. He did not interrupt her once. And then he said, in that same low, even voice, that he was sorry, that the gate positions were filled and the office was not his to hand out, and that the union had a hardship fund, and she should file the paperwork with the local, and that he hoped her husband's hand came back. She said his name once, the whole of it. Mr. Corvino, the way a person says a name when they are reaching for something and already know their arm is too short. He said good night. The door closed. He came back down the hall and sat, and picked up the ladle, and served his mother more soup, and asked her whether she had taken the 2nd tablet, and his face had not changed in any particular, not hardened, not softened, nothing had happened to it at all, and that, Rosalie understood, while sitting perfectly still, with a fork in her hand, was the entire thing. Not cruelty. Cruelty required somebody to be there. She waited until it was decent, and then she stood and thanked Josephine for the meal, and said she had a shift. And Josephine caught her wrist for a second and let it go. Rosalie went out through the narrow hallway past the covered piano, and the little girl on the stairs, who lifted a hand, and she lifted one back. She did not say her own name once the entire afternoon, not at the table, not at the door. It was not until the dishes were cleared that Elias, standing at the sink with his sleeves pushed up, asked his mother what the nurse's name was. The following Sunday he parked across the street and did not get out. He had done this so many times over 3 years that Augie no longer remarked on it. Simply put the car in park and looked straight ahead through the windshield at nothing in particular and waited, and the 2 of them sat there in the dark, with the engine off and the windows going slowly opaque. From that angle, the kitchen window was a lit rectangle above the hedge, and Elias could see the whole room in it the way you can see into a stage set from the cheap seats. His mother at the stove, the corner of the table, and his daughter standing up on the rung of a chair with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and both hands buried in a bowl. The nurse was there again. She had her hair tied back and she was saying something with her hands, describing the shape of something in the air, and Billy was watching her mouth, and then Billy tipped her head back and laughed. He could not hear it through the glass and the distance. He watched his daughter's whole face come open, the shoulders going up, the way a child laughs with the entire body because no part of her has learned yet to hold anything back, and he sat in a cold car 40 feet away and watched it the way a man watches weather in another country. Then the nurse said something else, and Billy laughed again and put a flowered handprint on her own cheek entirely by accident, and Elias found he had put his hand flat against the inside of the door. He waited. That was the arrangement he had made with himself, and he kept it the way he kept everything, without discussion. He waited until the light in the upstairs back bedroom came on, and then went off, and only then did he cross the street and let himself in through the front, because for 3 years the arithmetic had been simple and unvarying, and the arithmetic was that when he came into a room, his daughter stopped, Not fear. He had watched for fear, and there was none. She would come to him. She would let him carry her up the stairs, and let him sit on the edge of the bed, and let him put his hand on her hair, and she would look at him with her mother's exact eyes for as long as he could stand it, and she would not make a sound, not one, not in 3 years. And the sound that had been going in the kitchen a minute earlier would simply have been folded up and put away like something you do not use in front of company. So he waited outside in the car so that his mother's house could have a little longer with the noise in it. Josephine was at the sink. He hung his coat and said the girl seemed happy, and his mother said she was, and neither of them said anything else about it. And that was how they had discussed it for 3 years. On the table, pushed to one side and weighted down with the salt cellar, was a piece of butcher paper. He turned it toward himself with 2 fingers. 4 figures standing in the concrete yard under the fig tree, the tree done leaf by leaf with enormous patience, and the figures done with the same care, hair on all of them, eyes on all of them, hands with the correct number of fingers, one of them tall in a long dark coat, one of them small with wild curls, one of them old, one of them with her hair tied back. Every one of them had eyes. Not one of them had a mouth. Elias stood there with his hand on the table for a while. Behind him, the water ran and shut off. When Rosalie came down the hall with her coat over her arm, he was waiting by the front door, and he took an envelope out of his inside pocket and held it out to her, and it was not thick, and he had not been showy about it. It was simply the way a thing like this had always been done in his family. A debt registered and closed on the same evening. For the other night, he said, and for whatever you've been doing here on Sundays. Rosalie looked at the envelope. She did not take it, and she did not step back from it either. No, thank you. It isn't a tip. I know what it is. She put her coat on, one arm and then the other, taking her time with it. It's a way of squaring up so you don't have to think about it again. She looked at him then, straight on, and there was no tremor in it anywhere. I'm not a bill, Mr. Corvino. You can't pay me and be done. She said goodnight to his mother down the hall, and let herself out, and pulled the door shut behind her carefully so as not to wake anybody upstairs. And Elias Corvino stood alone in his mother's narrow hallway, with an envelope in his hand, and understood, with something that was not anger, and was not quite anything he had a name for, that in 34 years he had never once been refused by a person who was not afraid of him. It was the handwriting that started it. Rosalie had been going through the 4th floor, charting on a slow night, when she came across an old consult note of Winslow Pratt's, and something about the way he closed his letters, the way the tail of the last name ran off flat and hard to the right, like a man already standing up out of his chair, snagged on her the way a nailhead snags on a sleeve. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she requested her own brother's records, which she was entitled to do, and which she had never once done in 4 years, and they came through the release office in a plain envelope with her own name on it, and she took them home and put them on the kitchen table, and did not open them until she had made coffee she did not drink. Marrowfield Hospital, the emergency department, 4 years earlier, 2 visits inside of 30 hours. 17-year-old male, abdominal pain, vomiting, guarding on the right side, and then the line that had been sitting in her chest for 4 years the way a splinter sits under the skin. Patient appears anxious, likely gastritis versus substance-related, discharge with antiemetics, follow-up with primary care. There was no primary care. There had never been any primary care. Teddy Kerrigan had a sister who worked nights, and a state-issued card, and a face that made people decide things about him before he opened his mouth. And 30 hours later, a ruptured appendix and a peritoneal infection did what those things do when nobody looks twice, and he was 17, and then he was not. And at the bottom of both discharge summaries, in that flat, hard hand running off to the right, W. Pratt, M.D. She had been working 10 feet from him for 2 years. She had handed him charts. She had said good morning. Elias found out because Josephine found out, and Josephine found out because Nadine Brooks said 1 sentence too many in a hallway. And on the following Sunday, in the concrete yard by the wrapped fig tree, Elias came out and stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, and did not open with anything soft. My mother told me about your brother. Your mother talks too much. She does. He waited a moment. Winslow Pratt has a license, a mortgage in Balasinwid, 2 boys in a school that costs more a year than most of my men make, and a malpractice carrier that would drop him inside a week if the right file landed on the right desk. He has a brother-in-law with a gambling problem, which is the kind of thing that makes a man's finances interesting to look at. He said all of it without emphasis, the way another person would read off a grocery list. I can make one call. Not tomorrow. Tonight. By Christmas, that man will not be practicing medicine anywhere in this Commonwealth, and everyone who ever handed him a chart will know exactly why. Rosalie did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the burlap on the tree and at the light in the kitchen window, and she felt the whole shape of it. How easy it would be, how badly some part of her wanted it. How many nights across 4 years she had lain in the dark, constructing exactly this, and never once been able to build the last piece, which was the power. And here was a man holding the last piece out to her in the palm of his hand and asking nothing for it. "No," she said. "Say that again." "No." She turned to face him. "You want to know why? Because that man looked at a 17-year-old boy for 4 minutes and decided what kind of person he was, and then he stopped looking. That's the whole crime. That's all of it. He decided in advance, and then he quit paying attention." Her voice did not rise, but something underneath it did. "And if I let you take a phone call and turn him into a number in somebody's file, then I've done the identical thing. I've decided in advance and quit paying attention. I would be exactly what killed my brother." Just pointed the other direction. She shook her head once. "I don't want him ruined. I want him made to sit in a room and look at those 2 pieces of paper and say out loud what he did. And you can't buy that. That's not a thing money can go get for me." Elias Corvino stood in his mother's backyard in the cold, with his hands in his pockets, and looked at her. Not the glance a man gives a person who is in the way of what he is doing. Not the flat, courteous nothing he had handed her across a soup bowl. He looked at her the way he looked at a page of figures that had just come out wrong, all the way, taking his time, and she watched him do it, and did not look away, and neither of them said anything at all. And inside the lit window, his daughter was standing on the rung of a chair with both hands in a bowl. The call came in on a Tuesday, with the sirens arriving before the radio did, 2 of them stacking up on Ellsworth Street, and then the doors banging and the cold coming in with the gurney, and Rosalie was on the receiving side of it with her gloves already on. Industrial, crush mechanism, pelvis. The trauma team took him, and she moved with them and did what her hands knew how to do. And it was only afterward, when the bay had emptied out and the floor was being mopped, and somebody had bagged the clothing and set it on the counter to be tagged, that she saw the jacket. High-visibility orange gone gray at the cuffs, and across the back, stenciled in block letters that had been washed nearly to nothing. Delaware Avenue Terminal, and under it the smaller line, Corvino Shipping and Hauling. She stood there with her hand on the counter. Then she went to the board and read bed 14, and the board said Rourke, Peter J., 19 years old. She did not go home when her shift ended. She drove to the port with the heater going and the sky just beginning to go gray over the river, and Augie let her through the gate without a word because by then she was a person the gate knew, and she found Elias in the yard office at the end of the pier, with a hard hat sitting on the desk that he had clearly not worn, and 3 men standing around him who took one look at her face and found somewhere else to be. She did not sit. 9 had a hoist cable let go last night. I know. A boy went in with a crushed pelvis. He's 19. He'll be in that bed for 2 months if the pins take. I know that too. Then you also know that cable was old. Everybody down here knows it was old. Elias put down the paper he was holding. Ask me what you actually came to ask me. Fine. Are you the man who runs this? Yes. He said it without any give in it at all. I'm going to say the rest of it once, and then you can do whatever you want with it. I left when I was 22, packed a bag in the middle of the day so there wouldn't be a conversation about it, and stayed gone 6 years. And I did not call, and I did not come back when he got sick. He kept his eyes on her. Then my father died, and I came home for 2 days, and found 400 families on this pier who had spent their whole lives on it, and had exactly one place to go if this went to whoever came next. And whoever came next would have had it stripped and sold inside of a year. And every one of those men would have been standing in a parking lot in February wondering what happened. So you stayed. So I stayed. And I have spent 6 years hauling this thing an inch at a time towards something a man can put his name on in daylight. And I've got 2 years left on it. And I do not talk about it. To anyone. Ever. Because the day I start explaining myself down here is the day somebody decides I've gone soft and comes to find out. He stopped. That's the whole thing. That's everything I have. Rosalie stood very still in the middle of the yard office, with the light coming up gray on the river outside, and the cranes moving against it. That's a good speech, she said. You've never given it before, and I believe every word of it. And it doesn't touch what I came here about. Then say what you came here about. You have 400 families. I do. Then tell me the name of the boy in bed. 14. He did not answer. She waited. She let it go on long past the point of comfort. Watching him, and the thing she saw cross his face was not defensiveness and was not shame. It was something worse and much quieter, which was a man doing arithmetic in his head and coming up empty. You don't know it, she said. No. You knew his wife's name at the door 2 Sundays ago. She stood on your mother's front step and told you her husband couldn't hold a line anymore and asked you for a chair in an office, and you sent her to the hardship fund. And now he's got pins going into his hip because he went back out on the cargo deck with a hand that doesn't grip, on a rig you all knew was old. She picked her keys up off the desk where she had set them. You don't have 400 families, Mr. Corvino. You have 400 entries. There's a difference. And the difference is that a family has a name, and you have to be willing to hear it. She left him standing there. And when she was gone, Elias Corvino went out onto the pier in his overcoat with the cold coming off the water, and stood at the foot of number 9, looking up at the hoist and the frayed steel still hanging where it had parted. And then he did the thing he had not done in 6 years of running that waterfront, which was to walk the length of the dock and stop at every gang and ask a man his name. Walking the pier and asking names turned out to be the cheap part. The expensive part came 11 days later, when the maintenance file he had ordered pulled, came back, and the numbers in it did not match the numbers he had been signing for 2 years, and the countersignature on every deferral was his own, done in a hand close enough to his own that he had to hold 2 pages up to the window to be sure. He sat with that for a night. Then he sent for Salvatore Dunn. Sal had been on that waterfront for 40 years, longer than Elias had been alive. He had driven for the father. He had carried Elias down the length of the dock on his shoulders when the boy was 4 years old, so he could touch the underside of a container going over, and had kept the photograph of it in his wallet ever since, and had shown it to people so often that the corners had gone round. He came into the yard office with his hat in his hands, which Elias had never once seen him do in his life, and he did not wait to be asked. He said Rocco had come to him 2 years ago. He said it was only the paperwork, only moving a date, only initialing what had already been decided upstairs, and that he had told himself the whole time it was a bookkeeping matter. He said he was 68 and had nothing but this. He said a man gets to a certain age and finds out he is afraid, and he was afraid, and Rocco knew it, and used it. Then he took the photograph out of his wallet and put it face up on the desk between them. A young man in a work coat with a small boy up on his shoulders and both of them squinting into the sun. And he did not ask for his job. He asked to be allowed to stay on the pier in any capacity at all. Gate, yard, anything. Because he did not know how to be a man who was not down there in the morning. Elias let him say all of it. He did not interrupt once, and he did not look away from him. And when it was finished, he waited. And then he said one thing. You let them cut the line that put a boy in a hospital bed, and you countersigned my name to do it. That was all. He turned toward the window and stood with his back to the room, and Sal Dunn stood there for a moment holding his hat and then understood, and picked the photograph up off the desk with 2 fingers, and went out. He was off every list in the city by the end of the week. Nobody on that pier ever said his name in front of Elias again, and the ones who had liked him best said it least. And the entire waterfront learned in the space of 7 days that there was no length of history that bought a man anything, which was precisely what it had been meant to teach them. Rosalie had been in the outer office through the last of it, waiting to hand off a discharge summary for Petey Rourke that his wife had asked her to bring, and she had heard more of it than she wanted to. Augie drove them both back into the city with the heater going and nobody talking. Halfway through the tunnel under the river, a car came across the lanes ahead and stopped, and another came up behind and stopped, and Augie's hands settled at the top of the wheel and stayed there. Elias got out. He did not hurry. He walked up the tunnel in the yellow light with his coat open and stopped a few feet short of the first car, and he began to speak to the men standing beside it, and Rosalie could not hear a word of it through the glass. Only watch. He was naming them. She could see it in the way each man's face changed in turn, one after another down the line, as he went from one to the next, telling each of them something short, and whatever it was not a threat, because none of them looked angry. They looked exposed, the way a man looks when he has just learned exactly how thoroughly he has been read. She found out later he had told them the month each of them had come onto that waterfront, and who had signed them on. and finally that he knew who had put money in their pockets to be sitting in a tunnel that night. Then he stopped talking and stood there. They got back in their cars and pulled away. He came back and dropped into the seat beside her and said, "Drive." And Augie drove. And Rosalie Kerrigan sat with her hands flat on her own knees to keep them still, because they would not stay still, and looked out at the tile going past, and understood that she had spent weeks feeling sorry for this man, for the covered piano, and the cold car parked outside a lit window, and that the sorrow had been true, and had also been comfortable, and that what she felt now, for the first time, sitting 18 inches from him in the dark, was not sorrow at all. She stayed away 9 days. It was Josephine who ended it, calling the hospital switchboard and having Rosalie paged like a woman, summoning a doctor in 1952, and saying only that she had something in the house that belonged to her. So Rosalie came, on a Thursday, in the middle of the afternoon when she knew the black car would not be at the curb, and Josephine sat her down in the front room by the covered piano, and did not make coffee, and did not talk about the weather. She had a sheet of paper in her lap. "Before I hand this to you," she said, "I want you to understand I've had it 3 years, and I've read it more times than is good for a person. I'm not giving it to you to be cruel." She held it out. "Do you know the handwriting?" Rosalie took it. Hospital stationery, soft at the folds. She read the first line and did not understand what she was reading, and read it again. And then her eyes went to the bottom of the page, where a small forward-leaning hand had written R. Kerrigan, RN, and a date. And she looked at her own name for a long moment, the way a person looks at a word that has stopped meaning anything. "That's mine," she said. "That's my writing." "It is. I don't. Mrs. Corvino, I don't remember this." "No," Josephine said. "I didn't think you would." And Rosalie sat there in a chair in a narrow front room with a piece of paper in her hands, and did the thing she had trained herself out of doing, which was to try to count. 3 years. Nights. She could not even say how many hands. That was the whole obscenity of it. Somewhere in a stack of nights that had all gone the same way, in a room she could not have picked out of 10, she had sat down beside a woman who was not going to see morning, and had held on to her, and had written down what she was told to write down because the family was not there yet, and somebody had to, and had signed it, and handed it to whoever came, and had then gone home and slept, and gotten up and gone back in. Hundreds of hands. Her own life had been so full of them, that this one had simply gone in with the rest. Her name was Delphine, Josephine said quietly. She taught piano. "That instrument you keep looking at?" That was hers. He got the call in a warehouse office on the Delaware with a container half broken down outside and a dispute going about a manifest, and he did not answer it, because it was the 4th call that hour, and every one of them had been about the manifest, and because she had been home 2 days with a headache, and had told him herself that morning that it was nothing and to go. He saw it 11 minutes later. He came out of that building at a dead run and he told Augie to go, and Augie went, and every light on Columbus Boulevard was against them, and he sat in the back of that car with his phone in his hand, watching the numbers of the cross streets come up one at a time, and understood somewhere around Washington Avenue that he was not going to make it, and understood it completely, and refused it completely at the same time, which is a thing a man can only do for a few minutes before it takes something out of him permanently. He came through the doors of St. Bridget's into a corridor that was already quiet. Nobody was hurrying anywhere. That was how he found out, in the hallway, from the fact that nothing was happening, and he had spent 3 years not being able to remember what he had actually said into the phone that morning, only that he had said it while looking at a manifest. Rosalie was still holding the paper when the front door opened, because he had come earlier than either of them expected, and he stood in the hall with his keys in his hand, and looked at the sheet of stationery, and knew it at 40 feet, and his mother said his name once, and he did not answer her. Rosalie stood up. She could have handed it back and said nothing. She thought about that afterward for a long time, whether there had been a version where she said nothing. "I was there," she said. "I didn't know until 10 minutes ago. I was the nurse who stayed with her. I wrote that down for her." And she watched it go through him. Not fast. It went through him the way cold goes through a wall, and what came up in his face was not grief and was not anger. It was something with no give in it at all. "Get out of my mother's house. Elias. Not because of anything you did." His voice had gone down so low that Josephine, 4 feet away, leaned toward it without meaning to, and that was the frightening part, that it kept going down. "You sat with her. You held on to her. You did the thing that was mine to do, And you did it well. And you did it because you happened to be there." He was very still. "I can't look at you. Do you understand me? Every time I look at you from now until I'm dead, I am going to see the room I wasn't in." He stepped back from the doorway to clear the hall for her. "Go home." She got herself home. She was aware of doing it, and afterward could not have said how. The walk to the car, the turns, the parking, the 3 flights, the key in the lock, all of it happening at the far end of a hallway, with somebody else's hands. She did not turn on the lights. She got as far as the kitchen, and then simply sat down on the floor with her back against the cabinet door, and her coat still buttoned, and the room went slowly gray and then blue as the light left the window over the sink, and the refrigerator cycled on and cycled off, and she stayed where she was. After a while, she took out her wallet. The paper was in the fold behind her badge, worn to the softness of cloth along the creases, folded in 8 the way it had been folded in 8 for 4 years, and she had read it before every night shift she had ever worked, standing in the locker room with her thumb along the edge of it, the way another person might say a prayer or touch a doorframe. She did not read it. She held it in both hands in the dark and understood, all at once, with a completeness that took the breath out of her, that she had been carrying it as proof that she paid attention, proof that she was not one of them, and that it had made no difference at all, because somewhere inside the 4 years she had spent proving it, she had knelt beside a woman she could not now remember, and had gone home afterward and slept, and had been on the other side of the exact same arithmetic without ever knowing it, that she was not the person who never looked away. She was just a woman who had been on her feet for 6 years, and some of the hands had gone in with the rest. Her thumb was already at the edge. She tore it. She tore it once down the middle and then across, and then again. And the sound of it in the empty kitchen was very small. And she kept going until it was in pieces in her lap and on the linoleum around her, and then she stopped. And the stopping was worse than the tearing. She sat there. Then she made a sound she had never made in front of another person in her life, one time, into her own sleeve, and she put both hands over her face. It took her a while to move. When she did, she reached into her coat pocket and found what was always in her coat pocket, a roll of medical tape. And she pulled her knees up and began going through the pieces on the floor, turning each one right side up, fitting an edge to an edge, tearing off a strip with her teeth, because her hands were not steady enough to do it any other way. And she laid the tape across each seam and pressed it down flat with her thumb, over and over, in the dark, until the whole page was together again, a boy's name across the top, and a doctor's flat, hard signature at the bottom, and a lattice of white tape holding all of it in place. She folded it in 8. She put it back behind her badge. Then she got up off the floor and turned on the lamp and took the heavy cream envelope down from the shelf where it had been sitting for 6 weeks and opened it. It started in the panel box on the north wall of the cold storage house at 9, in wiring that had been scheduled for replacement 2 years earlier and deferred on a form with a signature that was not quite his. And by the time anyone smelled it, the smoke was already coming out along the roofline in a low, flat sheet, spreading sideways under the corrugated steel because it had nowhere else to go. Elias was 200 feet away in the yard office when the lights on the pier browned out and came back. He was outside before the second surge. Men were already running the other way, which is what men do and what they are supposed to do. And someone was shouting for the extinguishers, and someone else was on the phone, and the alarm on the fence post started up and made everything louder without making anything clearer. Augie caught his sleeve at the loading apron, and Elias took his arm back. 2 of the gang were still inside. Everyone knew it in the way a crowd knows a thing all at once. The doorway was a gray wall at chest height and clear underneath, and Elias took his overcoat off and went in low. The smoke came down the moment he was past the frame. He went by memory. Left along the racking, 40 feet, then the turn. And the building was making a sound he had never heard a building make. The steel overhead ticking, and then rising into a thin metal shriek as the panels flexed, and somewhere further in a section of shelving let go with a sound like a truck dropping its gate. He found the first man on his hands and knees against the base of a pallet stack, and got him up under the arms and got him moving, walking him bent double, one hand flat on the racking to keep the line, and put him out through the doorway into the arms of the crew, and turned around and went back in. It took longer the second time. The whole floor had gone gray by then, and he went the last of it on his knees. And when he found him, the man was not moving, and he got a shoulder under him the way he had been taught to lift on that same dock at 17 years old, and stood up with the whole weight of him, and walked. He did not run. He could not have run. He walked the length of that building with a grown man across his shoulders and one hand out for the racking. And the racking was hot enough that he had to keep letting go of it. And he counted the uprights. And somewhere past the last count, the air changed, and there was a color in the smoke ahead of him that was not gray. The first engine had come through the gate and put its lights on the doorway. Everyone on that pier saw the same thing at the same time. The flat white beam full of moving smoke, and inside it, coming forward out of the dark, one shape that was two men, low and slow and getting bigger, until the doorframe took him, and he came out through it, and went down on one knee, on the concrete apron with the weight still on him, and 8 men reached him at once. They brought all 3 of them to St. Brigid's because St. Brigid's was closest, and Rosalie heard it come over the radio the way she heard everything, as a list. 3 patients, smoke inhalation, 1 with chest trauma, and she was pulling gloves out of the box when the doors came open and the cold came in with them. She saw the coat first. It was over the end of the gurney, charcoal wool with the whole back of it gone gray, and she knew it before she looked up, and she looked up anyway. He was sitting rather than lying, which the paramedics had allowed because he had made it clear that they were going to allow it, and his face was streaked, and his hands were black to the wrist, and there was soot in the lines around his eyes, so that the eyes themselves looked very light. Nadine glanced over from the desk. Rosalie was already moving. She took Bay 9. She put the mask on him and told him to keep it there. She cut the shirt away because that is what you do, and did not ask permission for it, and worked her fingers along the ribs from the sternum out until he stopped breathing in and did not tell her he had, and she said nothing and marked the spot. She checked the fingertips. She turned the lamp and looked at the palms and turned each hand over and set it back down. She wrote. She sent the film order. She put the line in his arm on the first pass, which she had done 10,000 times, and which she did that night with her jaw set, and taped it down, and smoothed the tape flat with her thumb twice, and stood, and did not look at his face while she did any of it. He watched her the entire time. She could feel it the way you feel sun on the side of your neck. He did not thank her, and she did not want him to. And there was nothing in the bay but the hiss of the mask and the sound of the trauma team working 2 curtains over on the man he had carried out. And once, when the doors banged and someone shouted a name in the hallway, they both turned their heads at the same moment and then both turned back. When the film came up, she read it before the resident got there. 2 ribs on the left. Clean. No shift. Nothing under them. She stood at the screen with her arms folded and let the whole of it go out of her chest slowly. Then she came back and lifted the mask off his face to check the color of his lips and put it back on. He got the mask down with one hand anyway. You were off Thursdays. I swapped. She reached over and put the mask where it belonged and held it there with 2 fingers until he stopped fighting it. Don't talk. Breathe. And she wrote her initials in the corner of the sheet the way she wrote them on every sheet, and picked up his ruined coat off the end of the bed and folded it and set it on the chair where he could see it, and went out to the desk to call for the bed upstairs. They kept him one night for observation and sent him home to his mother's house because there was no one at the other place to check on him, and Josephine put him at the kitchen table with a bowl he did not want and stood with her back against the counter and did not sit down, which was how he knew. She started with the smaller of the 2. She said the surgery had been scheduled twice and moved twice, and that she had done the moving herself, on the telephone, without telling anybody, and that the second time the office had called it inadvisable, and she had said thank you and moved it anyway. He put the spoon down. He asked her why. She said, because I have been waiting 3 years to see you laugh at something, and I was not going to go under that knife before I did, in case I did not come back up, and I was not going to leave with the last picture of my son being the one I've got. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Then she went out of the room and came back with a folded sheet of paper and held it against her chest with both hands. There's another thing, and it's worse, and I'm going to say it badly. He waited. The night Delphine died, she was talking, near the end, and there was a nurse with her writing down what she said, because none of us had got there yet. That's the paper the girl wrote. Rosalie, she stopped. I've had it 3 years. I never gave it to you. He did not move at all. Ma. It isn't a goodbye, Elias. That's the trouble with it. If it had been a goodbye, I'd have put it in your hand at the funeral. Her voice began to go and she made it hold. It's a question. She left you a question, and I've read it more times than a woman ought to read anything, and every single time I decided the same thing, which was that if I gave it to you, you'd carry it around for the rest of your life trying to answer it, and it would eat you from the inside, and I could not watch that happen after everything else. So I put it in the drawer, and I told myself I was protecting you." She was crying now, without any noise, the way people of her generation cry. "And I have watched you for 3 years go quieter and colder and further away. And I have watched that child stop talking to you. And I have watched you park across the street from your own mother's house so you wouldn't spoil it. And every one of those nights I knew that paper was 30 feet from where you were standing. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself from what would happen when you read it. That's the truth, and I'm too old and too near a hospital to lie about it now." She put it on the table and slid it across with 2 fingers, and stepped back. "You should have had it 3 years ago. I'm sorry. There's no version of this where I'm not sorry." He looked at it for a long moment before he touched it. Then he opened it, and the handwriting was small and forward-leaning and steady, and he read it once straight through fast. And then he read it again very slowly, and his mother watched his face, and afterward would not describe to anyone what she saw in it. What was written there was not long. It said that she was not frightened. It said she had asked the nurse to write it down exactly, and not to smooth it out. It said she was not angry about the phone, that he was not to do that to himself, that she had told him to go that morning, and she would tell him again. And then, at the end, the question, which was not a reproach and was somehow worse for it. She wanted to know whether he was going to let this be the thing that closed him, or whether he was going to be the man she had watched play piano badly on purpose to make a 4-year-old laugh, and she said she was not going to be there to find out, and she wanted him to answer it out loud, to somebody, someday. He sat with the paper flat on the table under both hands for a long time. Then he said, without lifting his head, 3 years. I know. She asked me a question, and I've spent 3 years not answering it, because nobody told me it was asked. He said it evenly, and then his voice did something it had not done in the hearing of another human being since he was a boy. And he stopped, and put his hand over his eyes, and his mother came and stood behind his chair with both hands on his shoulders the way she had when he was small, and neither of them said anything for a while. When he could talk again, he asked her one thing, which was whether Rosalie had ever read what she had written down. Josephine said no. She had written it and signed it and handed it over and gone back to work. And she had not known until 3 weeks ago that any of it had happened at all. And Elias Corvino, a man who had been taught before he was old enough to argue that a debt was a rope with somebody else holding the far end, sat in his mother's kitchen with a dead woman's handwriting under his palms and said, quietly, that he owed that girl something he had no intention of ever paying off. They took her at 7 in the morning, and the surgeon said 4 hours, and it went 5. Elias sat in the family area on the 2nd floor in a plastic chair, with his elbows on his knees, and Augie sat 2 seats down and got up every so often to get coffee that nobody drank. And Billy was at the neighbors on Christian Street, where she would stay until it was over, because there was no reason for a child to spend a day in a room like that one. At 9:15, his phone went, and it was the terminal, and there was a great deal of noise behind the voice. Rocco Salvi had come through the gate at 6, with a folder and 2 lawyers and a proxy signed by 3 of the 5 on the holding board, and he had called a meeting in the Union Hall for that afternoon, and he was already sitting in the yard office with his coat off. Elias listened to all of it without saying anything, and then said he would call back. Upstairs the valve came out, and the new one went in, and the heart took it, and started again on its own, which the surgeon later said was the good kind of boring. At 11, the phone went again. 2 of the 5 had flipped that morning, and the 3rd would flip by noon, and there was a man from the shipping line in the room now, and paper on the table. Elias said he would call back. At noon, Augie said quietly that if he wanted to be there for the vote, there was time, that they could be at the pier in 20 minutes and back by 3, and that nobody would think a thing about it, and Elias did not answer him. At 12:30, the phone went a 3rd time, and the voice on it said, "They are calling the vote at 4. And if you are not standing in that hall, it is finished." And Elias Corvino looked at the double doors at the end of the corridor that had not opened in 5 hours, and pressed the side of the phone until the screen went black, and put it face down on the empty chair beside him, and did not touch it again. She came out at 12:40, and they told him she had done well. They kept her sedated the rest of the day, and into the evening, and the room they gave her was a corner room on the cardiac floor with a wall of monitors. And by night the whole floor had gone quiet the way hospitals go quiet, which is not silence but a lowering. Rosalie was not assigned to that unit. She had come up anyway, off her own shift, and was sitting in the chair by the window with her coat still on when the rhythm changed. She heard it before she saw it. The tone on the monitor lost its evenness, went ragged, ran fast, and then hesitated, and then ran again, and Josephine's hands moved on the blanket. Rosalie was up and had 2 fingers on the wrist before the alarm finished its first cycle, and what was under her fingers was not what was on the screen, which is the thing that frightens people who know what they are doing. The night resident came in at a walk, looked at the monitor for perhaps 6 seconds, and said it was post-operative atrial fibrillation, extremely common, that they would rate control her and reassess in the morning, and told the nurse to silence the alarm. Then he said they were moving her down to the step-down unit to free up the corner room. Rosalie put herself between the bed and the door. She did not raise her voice, and she did not explain herself, and she did not, this time, ask anyone for anything. She said that the patient was 30 hours out from an aortic valve replacement, that her rate was over 150, and her pressure was falling, that the pulse at the wrist did not match what the screen was showing, and that nobody was moving this bed out of a monitored room until the cardiologist on call had come down and put his own hands on her. The resident told her she was not on this unit. She said she was aware of that. He told her to step aside. She said no. He said her name in the voice men use when they are about to start talking about consequences. And Rosalie Kerrigan stood where she was with her hand on the bed rail and said, "Get him on the phone, or I will, and then you and I will both explain to him in the morning why one of us didn't." The charge nurse looked at the resident. The resident made the call. The cardiologist came down in 9 minutes in a fleece over scrubs, put his hand on Josephine's neck, watched the screen for less than a minute, and said the word cardioversion. And after that everything moved very fast and very well, and nobody spoke to Rosalie at all, except the cardiologist, who said, on his way out, that whoever had caught the mismatch had bought them about 2 hours. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, 11 miles away, in a union hall on the Delaware with 200 men standing along the walls, Rocco Salvi had called the vote and taken the terminal, and had made a point of saying, twice, for the room, that he had personally telephoned Elias Corvino 3 times that day, and that Elias Corvino had not picked up. He came into the union hall the next morning on foot, alone, with the tape still on his hands, and moving the way a man moves when one side of him has been told not to, and 200 longshoremen watched him come up the center aisle. And not one of them said anything, because the entire waterfront had spent the night saying the same sentence to each other, which was that he had not picked up the phone. Rocco Salvi was already at the table at the front with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, a man occupying a chair he had waited a long time to sit in. Elias did not go around the table. He stopped at the near edge of it and set down a manila folder and opened it, and began laying photographs out across the wood, one at a time, side by side, until there were 11 of them. They were not dramatic pictures. They were the kind of pictures an insurance man takes. Frayed steel at the eye of a hoist. A junction box with the cover off and the wiring gone the color of tobacco. A date stamp in the corner of each one. He turned them so they faced the room. Then he said, loud enough to carry to the back wall and no louder, "Peter Rourke, 19 years old, day gang at 9. He is at St. Bridget's with pins in his hip, and he will be there through February." He let that sit. The line that put him there was flagged for replacement 2 years ago, and deferred 11 times, and every one of those deferrals was countersigned with my name, and I did not write a single one of them, and I did not check, and that second part is mine, and I am not going to stand here and pretend it isn't. A murmur started along the side wall and stopped. I am not asking anybody in this room to vote again. I am telling you what I have been doing for the last 2 years while I was not checking that paperwork. He took a second folder out of his coat. There is a company. It has a name, a charter, a board, and a 2-year audit trail. And as of Monday, every contract, every berth, every piece of equipment, and every man on this pier moves into it. Straight books, real safety inspections with an outside firm, a pension nobody can reach into. It has been sitting finished in a lawyer's office since June, waiting for me to be ready to lose what it costs to switch it on. And last night I found out I am ready. Somebody near the front said, out loud, "Lose what?" And Elias said, "Everything that made this place worth taking from me, which is why it's still standing here." Rocco stood up. He put both hands flat on the table among the photographs and he said one sentence, and he said it to the room, and not to Elias. "Your father told me this was mine, and then you came back and took it, and I have sat in the second chair for 6 years waiting for one of you to remember that." Then he came around the table fast. It was one punch. The sound of it went through that hall the way a dropped crate goes through it. Flat and short. And 200 men came up off the benches at once, and nobody got there in time. And Elias went sideways into the edge of the table, and down onto one knee with his hand pressed to his side where the tape was. The hall made a noise, and then stopped making it, because he did not get up the way a man gets up to answer that. He got up slowly, using the table, and he straightened as far as he could straighten, which was not all the way, and he touched his fingers to the corner of his mouth and looked at them, and let his hand drop. That was all. He stood there with his arm across his ribs, and looked at Rocco Salvi for a moment. And Rocco was standing with his fist still half closed, and his chest going, and the whole room was watching him do it now, instead of watching Elias. Then Elias turned back to the table and put his hand on the photographs to square them up. "As I was saying," he said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not attempt to make it steady. "The transfer is Monday. Anybody who wants out takes his severance and his pension, and nobody comes looking. Anybody who stays under real books, and the first man who defers a safety line under my name again is going to have to explain it in a room with a stenographer in it." Nobody moved for a second. Then a man in the third row named Dooley stood up, and then the whole third row stood, and then it went backward through the hall like a wave going the wrong way up a beach, men getting to their feet in 2s and 3s and turning, some of them turning fully around, so that they were facing the back wall, until Rocco Salvi was standing at the front of that room in front of 200 backs. He looked at all of it, then he picked his coat up off the chair and walked out through the middle of them, and nobody put a hand on him, and nobody said his name, and the door at the end of the hall banged once and settled. The letter came on a Tuesday, 8 days later, in an envelope with the state seal on it, and Rosalie read it standing up in the hallway outside her own apartment, with her keys still in her hand. A formal complaint had been filed with the Board of Nursing alleging practice outside the scope of licensure, obstruction of a physician's treatment plan, and interference with patient transfer, in 2 separate incidents at St. Brigid's, the first involving an elderly patient in the emergency department, and the second involving a post-surgical patient on the cardiac floor. Pending review, her license was suspended. She was to surrender her badge to her nurse manager within 48 hours. Nadine drove over that night and sat at the kitchen table and read it twice and said the word Corvino before she had finished the second page, and half the hospital had said the same word by Thursday, because a hall full of longshoremen had watched a man get knocked down and get back up and take a waterfront away from Rocco Salvi. And everybody who had heard that story understood that a man like that does not simply go home, and they were not wrong about him. Rocco had put the file together. He had been building it since the week she first walked into that house on Christian Street, and he had told his lawyer, in a sentence that would come out much later and would sit in Rosalie's stomach for the rest of her life, that Elias Corvino had exactly one soft place left in him, and it wore a name tag. But Rocco Salvi was not a nurse, and could not file with the Board of Nursing, and a complaint from a stevedore about a hospital is a piece of paper nobody opens. It had to come from inside. Rosalie went in on Thursday to hand over her badge, and it was Nadine who put the copy of the complaint in her hand in the locker room, the whole thing, the last page included, and Rosalie turned to the signature line expecting a stranger. Winslow Pratt, M.D. She stood there a long moment, and then, standing in front of an open locker with her badge already off her chest, she watched the entire architecture of it assemble itself. And it was so simple that it was almost restful, because if she was right about that woman in the emergency bay, and the echocardiogram said she was right, then Winslow Pratt had signed a discharge order that would have sent a woman home to die on a staircase, and that fact was now sitting in a chart with a nursing note under it in her handwriting and a timestamp beside it, and it was not the first one. 2 summers before he came to St. Brigid's, he had been at Marrowfield, where he had put his signature at the bottom of 2 discharge summaries for a 17-year-old boy in 30 hours. And 3 years before that, at the same hospital, he had sent a young woman home with a headache, and the words tension and stress written in his flat, hard hand, and 2 weeks later that young woman had died in a house on Christian Street, and her name had been Delphine Corvino, though Rosalie did not yet know that last part, and would not know it for another 11 days. He was not attacking her. That was what she understood standing at the locker. A man who attacks you has some feeling about you. Winslow Pratt had looked at a nursing note in a chart and seen a rope with his own name on the end of it. And he had done the only arithmetic available to him, which was that if the nurse was found to be a person who overstepped, who inserted herself, who obstructed physicians, Then every note that nurse had ever written became the complaint of a difficult woman, rather than the record of a doctor who had stopped looking. He was not trying to end her career. He was trying to make her unbelievable. Rocco had handed him the shovel, and Pratt had been the one holding it, and neither of them had needed to say a word to the other about why. The rest came on Friday. The fellowship office in Denver called her at 10 in the morning, a woman with a kind voice who took a long time getting to it, and said that they had received a copy of a licensure action from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that their governing agreement required an unencumbered license at the time of appointment, that this was in no way a judgment about her, that she was welcome to reapply in a future cycle. Rosalie thanked her and hung up and sat down on the edge of her bed. The envelope she had finally opened in a dark kitchen 5 weeks earlier was still on the shelf by the door with the acceptance letter folded inside it, and her own handwriting on the back where she had begun to write down questions to ask. Them, 2 years, fully funded, to build a retrospective review system for missed and mistriaged discharges, in a program that existed because a hospital in Colorado had lost 3 patients in one winter to exactly the thing that had taken her brother. It was the only thing she had ever wanted that was for herself. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while with the phone still in her hand, and then she got up and went to the shelf and put the letter back in the envelope and squared the edges and did not throw it away. He came to her door on the Sunday with the tape off his hands and his ribs still holding him a little crooked, and he did not sit down, and he had it laid out before she had closed the door behind him. There was a firm on Market Street that did nothing but board actions. The senior man there owed him a considerable favor and would take it that afternoon. There was a member of the board itself who had a son on the waterfront. There was the fellowship in Denver, whose endowment took money from 4 foundations, 2 of which he could reach before Tuesday. He said, "One call, and this stops." He said it the way another man would offer to carry something heavy, and Rosalie stood in her own kitchen, with the taped page still behind her badge, in a wallet she no longer needed, and said no, and watched something go through his face that was almost funny. "I'm not doing this again with you," he said. "The last time you told me no, it was your brother. I know. This is your license. I know exactly what it is." She pulled a chair out and sat down so he would sit down. "If you make that call, I win." "Fine. And for the rest of my life, the way I got it back is that a man with your last name spoke to somebody, and every person in that building will know it, and the next nurse who catches something and gets told to step aside will look at what happened to me, and she will step aside. Nothing changes. He signs the next one. He signs the one after that." She put her hands flat on the table. "I don't want the call. I want something else, and it's worse, and I'm going to ask you for it anyway." He waited. "Come to the hearing. Give your name into the record, on tape, with a stenographer, and answer questions about your wife under oath." She watched him go absolutely still. "I'm asking you to explain yourself in a room full of strangers, out loud, in your own voice, which I understand is the one thing your father spent your whole childhood telling you never to do." He was quiet for a long moment. "Do you understand what that does to me down there?" "Yes. Everything I've built for 2 years assumes nobody has ever heard me say anything about anything. I know, you are asking for the one thing I have never given. Anyone. I am." He looked at the window for a while. Then he said, "All right," and did not say anything else, and left, and did not call anybody. The hearing was set for a Thursday, in a state office building on Arch Street. And what arrived in that room was not what anybody had expected, because Nadine Brooks had spent 9 days on the telephone, and the nurses' union had taken it up as an institutional matter, and there were 14 signed statements from nurses at St. Brigid's, and 2 from Marrowfield, and a labor attorney the union paid for, and 11 nurses in the gallery in street clothes who had traded shifts to be there. Rosalie sat in the corridor beforehand with her hands in her coat pockets, and in the left pocket was a piece of butcher paper, folded in quarters that a small girl had put into her hands the previous afternoon without a word, a drawing of a fig tree with the burlap coming off it, and green showing underneath. And she took it out and looked at it and put it back, and then she went in. She testified for 50 minutes. She brought the notebook, 6 years of it, every escalation she had ever made, dated, with outcomes, in her own hand, and the union attorney entered the whole thing. She described the night in the emergency bay, the delayed pulse, the murmur, the discharge order she had declined to sign, the note she had written into the record, the call to the charge nurse, the call to the rapid response line, and what the echocardiogram had shown 35 minutes later. Elias Corvino came in after the recess. He gave his full name for the record, and spelled it, and did not look at anybody in the gallery, and he sat with his hands on the table and answered questions for 26 minutes about a woman who had gone to an emergency department 3 years earlier with a headache she could not stand, and had been sent home with the words tension and stress, and had died at their house 2 weeks later. And he said all of it in a flat, quiet voice with a stenographer taking down every word. And then the union attorney laid 3 documents in front of the panel side by side and read the names on them out loud. Theodore Kerrigan, 17 years old, discharged twice in 30 hours. Delphine Corvino, 31 years old, discharged with instructions to rest. Josephine Corvino, 73 years old, discharged order written, not executed. The same flat, hard signature ran off to the right at the bottom of all 3. Winslow Pratt sat through the reading with his hands folded. When the chair asked him whether he wished to respond, he did not stand. He said that the complaint was his, that he had filed it, and that he had filed it because he had understood what those 2 nursing notes would come to mean once somebody put them next to each other. Then he said the rest of it, and it took him almost 4 minutes, and by the end of it, a woman on the panel had stopped writing. The board restored her license in 11 days with the complaint dismissed and a letter of commendation attached to the file, and the following Saturday was the first warm one of the year, the kind of morning in that city when every back door on the block opens at once, and Josephine declared that the tree was coming out of its wrapping whether the weather was ready or not. So they all went out into the little concrete yard, Josephine in a lawn chair with a blanket over her knees that she kept pushing off, Rosalie on one side of the trunk with a pair of shears, Elias on the other working the twine loose, and Billy going round and round the tree collecting every cut length of string into a coffee can, as though it were a job she had been hired to do. The burlap came away in long strips, damp on the inside and smelling of wet earth. And underneath the branches were pale and stiff, and along the whole length of them, the first green was already out, small and folded and impossibly bright, and Billy stopped her circling and stood looking up at it with her mouth open. Josephine said, out of nowhere, still watching the child, that she had taken her to a woman in Winfield the first winter. Rosalie turned her head. Josephine said that the pediatrician had given her the name, that she had been going every second week for 3 years, and that the woman had explained it to her early on so she would stop trying to fix it at the kitchen table. Selective mutism, she said, was the phrase. It was not stubbornness, and it was not damage, and it was not something a person did on purpose, and above all, it was not something you could talk a child out of. It happened sometimes to children after a loss, where the speaking simply stopped in the one place the fear had attached itself to, and it stayed stopped. And the worst thing anybody could do was push, because pushing put the fear right back where it was. What it needed was time, and it needed the room to be safe, and it needed nobody making it a performance. She said all of that in her ordinary voice, snapping a piece of twine between her fingers. Then she said the other part, quieter, still not looking at her son, that there had been a phone call one afternoon 3 years ago, that the child had been standing in the room where the call happened, and had been 4 years old, and had understood only about half of it, and that the half she understood was the half nobody would have wanted her to keep, that she had never told him this, that the therapist had said it plainly the second winter, and Josephine had carried it since, and that she was too old now to carry any more of anybody's business for them. Elias had stopped working on the twine. He stood there with his hands full of it, and did not say anything at all. Rosalie went back to cutting because there was nothing else to do that was any use, and the shears made their small sound, and the morning went on around them the way mornings do. A radio somewhere, a screen door, a bus on the avenue 2 blocks off. Nobody made a speech. Nobody knelt down and asked the child anything. That was the only reason it happened. The last of the burlap came off. Elias gathered it into a bundle against his chest and turned to carry it to the alley, and he was 3 steps toward the gate when there was a pull at his sleeve. He looked down. Billy had the coffee can in one hand, full of string, and had taken hold of his cuff with the other, and she was looking up at the branches, and then at him, and then at the branches again, and she pointed at the highest green on the tree, up past where any of them could reach, and she said, "Dad." 1 word, not loud, the kind of word a child says 100 times a day in every house on that street, and nobody in any of those houses ever hears. Elias Corvino stood absolutely still. Then the bundle of burlap went out of his arms onto the concrete, and he went down onto his knees in the middle of that yard, all at once, The way a man goes down when the thing holding him up has been removed rather than broken. And he put his arms around his daughter, and he put his face against her shoulder, and he made no attempt whatsoever to hide any of it. Not from his mother 4 feet away, not from Rosalie, not from the open windows of 6 houses. A man who had been raised from the age of 11, never to let another living soul see that he needed anything, knelt on the concrete in the sun and held on to a 7-year-old child and shook, and Billy stood there and patted the back of his head with the flat of her hand, twice, in the businesslike way of a child comforting an adult, still holding her can of string. Josephine turned her face toward the fence and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. Rosalie set the shears down on the arm of the lawn chair, very carefully, so they would not make a noise, and stepped back and let them have it. She went to Denver in September. The fellowship office called back in June, 2 weeks after the letter of commendation was entered into her file, and the woman with the kind voice said that the encumbrance had been removed and the seat was still open if she wanted it, and Rosalie said yes before the sentence was finished. Elias drove her to the airport himself. He did not talk about it in the car, and he did not ask her once whether she was sure, and he did not make a single arrangement on her behalf, and she understood later that this had cost him more than the hearing had. At the curb, he took her bag out of the trunk and set it upright on the sidewalk and stepped back from it, and that was the whole of what he did. Billy had come along in the back seat with a folded piece of butcher paper on her lap the entire way, and she got out and handed it over and said, "Take it on the plane," and Rosalie opened it standing on the curb with the traffic going past. It was the yard, the fig tree with its leaves all the way out, done leaf by leaf with the same enormous patience. 4 figures underneath it, 1 tall in a long dark coat, 1 small with wild curls, 1 seated in a lawn chair, 1 with her hair tied back. Every one of them had eyes. And every one of them, this time, had a mouth. 2 years is not long. The Kerrigan Protocol was written in the second of them, in a conference room at St. Bridget's, with the nurses' union at the table, and Rosalie on speaker from Colorado, and it was 3 paragraphs long, and had nothing complicated in it. Any patient, or any family member of a patient, may request 1 further examination before discharge. No reason has to be given. No physician's permission is required. The request goes in the chart, and the chart gets a second set of eyes. And nobody has to explain themselves. And nobody has to be the kind of person who knows how to make a fuss in a hospital, because the people who die of that are almost always the people who never learned how. They put a small brass plate on the wall outside the emergency department with a boy's name on it, and the years he lived, 17 of them. And underneath, the line about how a family may ask again. Winslow Pratt signed the implementation order first. He had surrendered his license 11 months earlier, and he came back to that building 1 time to do that one thing, and he asked to see the plate, and he stood in front of it for a while, and then he left, and nobody ever saw him there again. They were married the following spring, in the concrete yard under the fig tree, with about 30 people packed in shoulder to shoulder, and the neighbors watching from their back windows. And Billy carried the rings in a coffee can, because she had insisted on the coffee can, and Josephine sat in the front in a good coat and cried through the entire thing and told everybody afterward that it was the son. She had 4 more years. She got to be there for all of it, the wedding and the plate on the wall, and the day the port went fully onto clean books, and Elias signed his name in daylight on a charter with an outside auditor's seal at the bottom of it, and she got to hear her granddaughter talk her ear off across a kitchen table every single day for 4 years. Which she said more than once was the only thing she had ever actually asked anybody for. She died in her own bed in that narrow house with her family around her, in her sleep, in the early part of a morning in October. Near the end, she was awake for a while, and she had Rosalie sit on the edge of the bed, and she held onto her hand with a grip that was still stronger than it had any right to be. And the last thing she said to her was that she had been thinking about the rain, and about how a person could go down on a public sidewalk in front of the whole world, and lie there being looked at by everybody and seen by nobody, and how a young woman she had never met had knelt down in a puddle in her only coat and made her the most important thing on that entire street. She said, "That is all any of us are asking for, honey." Then she slept, and she did not wake up again, and they buried her beside her husband and her daughter-in-law on a clear, cold day. That evening, after the house had emptied out, Elias and Rosalie sat on the back step with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them and the fig tree bare again and waiting to be wrapped. And inside the house, somebody was playing the piano badly and stopping and starting over. a girl of 11 working through the same 8 bars her mother had once taught to other people's children, and Elias listened to it for a while, and then said that his father had raised him to believe power was the ability to make a room full of people look at the floor when you walked in, and that it had taken him 34 years and a nurse kneeling in a puddle on Passyunk Avenue to work out that real power is the exact opposite, that it is the ability to make one single human being lift their face up. 3 cars had gone by that evening. 3 drivers who were not cruel and were not monsters, who were tired and running late and thinking about dinner, and who each decided in less time than it takes to breathe that this was somebody else's to deal with. One person did not. That is the whole distance between a life that ends at a bus shelter and a family in a small backyard in South Philadelphia, and it is never as far as it looks. Nobody in this story was asked to be a hero. They were only asked to keep looking at a person for 4 seconds longer than was comfortable, and everything came from that. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear a new story with us every day. We would truly love to know what this one stirred in you, so tell us in the comments, honestly and from the heart, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Wishing you good health, a peaceful spirit, and joy in your ordinary days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.